Hey guys, so we're going to take a look at the muscles of the forearm, and fair warning, can be a little overwhelming, especially if this is your first anatomy class. If it's undergraduate anatomy 101 and you're just seeing this stuff for the first time and being exposed to all these Latin names for the first time, can be a little confusing, but the good news is that, at least in my class, I will not be quizzing you on origins and insertions, especially since it's this weird new online format. Um, so that makes it about 100 million times easier, roughly. So it's just straight ID. So basically, if I put an X right here, I want you to tell me that that's a brachioradialis. Okay, so that's the goal for today, to be able to do that for all of the muscles of the forearm. Now, it's always easiest to learn these by chunking them. And that is a scientific term that I didn't come up with. That's something my anatomy teacher talked about. And chunking makes sense. We can only really memorize 7 to 8 chunks of information max. That's on the high end. And what that means, and that's actually studied scientifically. So what that means is you can memorize easily 8 numbers if you memorize one by one, 1, 4, 7, right? But you can memorize much more than 8 numbers, right? A phone number is 10 numbers. So you're not limited to, 5 to 8 digits. You're limited to 5 to 8 chunks. So that's why phone numbers are split up into 3 chunks. There's 4 if you include the 1. 1 plus the area code, first 3, last 4. It's only 4 chunks of information, right? Yeah, 4 chunks of information, but it's 10 digits. So your brain has this ability to chunk things. And I don't pretend to understand it on the scientific level, but it's a proven thing that our brain can do. That's why social securities have dashes. It just makes it's easier to group things together. And that applies to anatomy as well. It applies everywhere in anatomy, but especially the forearms. Because what we do is, instead of teaching you, let's say there's 30 forearm muscles, there's not, but let's say there is. Rather than having you memorize those 30 muscles, we can break it into 2 groups of 15 or 3 groups of 10. It just makes it a little bit easier. So we're going to do that. And the way I like to chunk them, and I think most people would chunk them the same way, is by chunking them into an anterior compartment and a posterior compartment. And I also kind of like to call this flexors and extensors. Okay, so these to me are the flexors. Now, it's important to know they don't all flex necessarily. Most of them do. Actually, I think they all do in this case, but that's not the case for the extensors. Anyway, the point is they all have this common origin off the medial epicondyle, or they're in the anterior compartment, one or the other. And it just makes sense to group them this way. When you look at the forearm, doesn't it look like these muscles go together? It's a group, they're anterior muscles, but it gets a little tough. You don't want to accidentally include this muscle, brachioradialis. I like to include it with the extensors. And when you look at it from a posterior view, it's easy to see why. It has kind of that common lateral origin with these other extensors, okay? So it's almost like you're grouping them medial and lateral, even though often they're referred as anterior and posterior compartment muscles. But anyway, so that will hopefully make more sense as we go. So let's just run through them really quick. So right here we have pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, and flexi ulnaris. Look at them. They go in order. Your notes are in the same order from anponline.com. And that's just easy to knock those out. You memorize them together. Pronator teres, flexor carpi ulnaris, palmaris longus. I already messed up. Flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, and flexor carpi ulnaris. Flexor carpi radialis and ulnaris do about the same thing. They both flex the wrist, but one inserts over here on more of the radial side, closer to the thumb. It actually inserts, I believe, metacarpal 2 and 3, whereas flexor carpi ulnaris inserts on the pisiform, which then splits into uh, the base of metacarpal 5 and the hamate, I believe. Let's actually look. Okay, so they're drawing it a little bit different than I'm used to, because they have it split before the pisiform. I'm typically used to seeing it go to the pisiform and then splitting into the hamate in the base of metacarpal 5, but that's okay. There's no wrong way. I mean, uh, it's tough because when I dissect these on a real cadaver, there's so much fascia and connective tissue, and sometimes it's tough to say, what do we remove and what do we not remove. Hopefully you get the experience to dissect a cadaver. You will learn that it's not nearly as clear cut as this. But anyway, so I'm not going to ask you about insertion, so that doesn't matter anyway. The point is flexor carpi radialis. You know it's radialis because it's closer to the thumb. Ulnaris is closer to the pinky. Now let's go through these one at a time and slow down a little bit. So pronator teres, it originates up here off the common flexor tendon, which is what we call all of these muscles that originate off the medial epicondyle. We say they originate from the common flexor tendon. Anyway, this does not go into the hand like a lot of the other muscles. It just comes across over here to the radius because all it does is pull the radius. Its job is to pull the radius over the ulna to cause pronation. That's why we call it pronator teres. And now let's get rid of them as we name them. And then this guy right here, flexor carpi radialis, flexes the wrist. It attaches radially over on a more lateral metacarpal versus the ulnaris. When I say radially, I mean more lateral. This muscle here is cool. So I have been conducting a very unofficial study, and I always ask my students to check if they have this muscle. And you might be thinking, wait, what? Not everyone has this muscle. I actually only have one. I have my right palmaris longus, but I don't have a left. And that's actually more common than having none, believe it or not. The most common is to have both. So most of you probably have both of your palmaris longi. Some of you will only have one, and you're probably missing your left. Some of you may be missing your right, though. That's very rare. And then even rarer is missing both. So what I have found, and this is not written in any textbook, no one else has ever looked at this, but what I have found is that most people cannot snap if they're missing their palmaris longus. So I can snap with my right hand because I have a palmaris longus there, but I can't snap with my left hand. I can kind of make a noise, but I don't actually snap. And I don't have a left palmaris longus. I've had one student that had neither of their palmaris longi, and they couldn't snap at all. And then 100% success rate so far. If you're missing a palmaris longus, you can't snap. And that's not its official function, of course. Its official function is to tighten the palmar fascia, which I don't really know the importance of that. Obviously, people are missing this muscle and they function just fine. But anyway, it's just kind of interesting. Oh, how do you check? Well, it's really tough to walk you through it over a microphone. It's much easier to show you. But basically, let's say I'm checking my right hand to see if I have a palmaris longus. I would oppose my thumb and my pinky. So push your thumb and pinky together and then resist wrist flexion. So what that means is like push down against your thumb and pinky with your left hand and try to push up with your right hand, like to flex your wrist. And you'll see a little tendon pop up in the middle of your wrist. That's your palmaris longus tendon. It's really skinny. It's this tiny little skinny tendon. And then when I do it, I notice I only have that skinny little tendon pop up on the right. I don't have one on the left. Oh, and you know what? I should check my 3-year-old daughter to see if she has one, see if it's genetic. Anyway, oh, that was a big tangent. I'm sorry, guys. So that's palmaris longus. Here's flexicarpi ulnaris. All right, so that's kind of the first layer of the flexors. Then underneath that, we have flexor digitorum superficialis. And when you're talking about these muscles, you can use acronyms FDS, FDP, FCU, FCR. Don't do that on a quiz, though. Okay. So anyway, superficialis. One of the key things that's interesting about it is that its tendon splits. I don't know if you see this yellow tendon splitting, and then the muscle right underneath it, which is called flexor digitorum profundus, goes through that split all the way to the distal phalanx. So superficialis goes to the middle phalanx, profundus goes to the distal phalanx. And so here are those muscles again. Superficialis covers profundus. Profundus is underneath. So let's remove superficialis, and there's profundus right there. Boom. 2 big finger flexors. That only leaves us with 2 muscles. This one in a cadaver looks so much like a feather, you can't miss it. And it looks like a feather here too, I guess. what else do I want to say about it? Oh, it goes all the way to the distal phalanx. This is what you flex your thumb with. This is kind of your video game muscle. Um, and did I name it? No, flexor pollicis longus, FPL, flexor pollicis longus. It's called longus because you have a brevis in here somewhere. There it is, brevis. But that's a hand muscle. We're not going to cover hand in this class. So flexor pollicis longus, let's hide that. And then this last muscle is a pronator. You can imagine it might pull the radius over the ulna. And it's also square, so we call it pronator quadratus. I love names that make sense. Pronator quadratus. And we did it. You did all the flexors. Let's bring them back. Boom. Look at all that. Real quick run through. Pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor carpi ulnaris. You guys are crushing it. Don't mix this up with the flexors. Even though it is an elbow flexor, we group it with the extensors or with the posterior forearm musculature. All right, flexor digitorum superficialis, split tendon. When I do the quiz, I'll try to somehow include the tendon so you can see it maybe. Underneath superficialis is profundus, goes all the way to the distal phalanx. Flexor pollicis longus, pronator quadratus. Boom, you guys did it. All right, now let's go to the extensors. All right, so guys, when I say extensors, that is a very unofficial term that I use. They're really it's your posterior compartment or your posterior forearm muscles. One of these actually isn't even really a forearm muscle, quote unquote. I mean, it is because it's in your forearm, but it flexes your elbow. That's its only job. It doesn't go to the wrist or the fingers at all. But anyway, neither here nor there. Let's run through them. Brachioradialis is this first big muscle. It originates high on the lateral supracondylar ridge. Right underneath it is extensor carpi radialis longus. Now where there's a longus, you can best believe there's a brevis. Now in a cadaver, this sort of fits almost kind of like a hot dog in a bun with the brevis underneath it, or at the very least it sort of covers up brevis. And they've done a good job of that here. You can see brevis is sort of hidden underneath it. So if we remove longus, you still can't even really see it. We've got to get rid of ed. So there it is, brevis, extensor carpi radialis brevis. So brachioradialis, which is an elbow flexor. Extensor carpi radialis longus, which is a wrist extensor and radial deviator. Extensor carpi radialis brevis, which is another wrist extensor and radial deviator. Those are those first big three muscles, okay? And just so you guys know, a radial deviator versus an ulnar deviator. So if you were to deviate your wrist that way, that's radial deviation. Deviate it that way is ulnar deviation. Versus flexion and extension would be like this. Wrist flexion, wrist extension. So it's kind of cool if you think about it this way. So let's refresh it. All right, so where's our FCR? Here we go. Flexor carpi radialis, right? Here's extensor carpi radialis longus. This one flexes the wrist, this one extends the wrist. But if you fire them both, you radially deviate, right? Because they both attach radially. So they pull the wrist radially. So even though they're opposites in terms of flexion and extension, they work together to radially deviate. Just like flexor carpi ulnaris and extensor carpi ulnaris, they're opposite muscles, right? This one flexes, this one extends, but if they work together, they ulnarly deviate. So these four muscles, or really five, so your flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris, extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis, and extensor carpi ulnaris, these four muscles basically control your wrist. Flexion, extension, ulnar deviation, radial deviation, based on which ones are firing at which time. It's kind of cool if you're into kinesiology, but I digress because this is not kinesiology, it's anatomy. So let's recap really quick. Brachioradialis, extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, and that's as far as we've gotten. Brachioradialis, Doesn't make it all the way into the wrist, but the two extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis do. They make it down here to the base of these metacarpals. And then I think we're good with those, right? Those three, brachioradialis, extensor carpi radialis longus, and extensor carpi radialis brevis. Hidden, very hidden. On a quiz, though, I could remove some of this stuff. I'll always try to leave longus in just so you can see longus versus brevis, right? Guys, you can see how this is going to be tough. So when I do the quiz, I think what I'll try to do is I'll try to like zoom in and zoom out with the video so you can kind of see the insertion versus the origin, that kind of a thing. I'll do my best, okay? It's going to be hard though. You're going to need to probably buy this app and practice a lot with this app, or at least Google Images and that kind of thing. Okay, so let's keep this train going. How about we go in the same order as your notes? So brachioradialis, extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, and Ed. We call this guy Ed, extensor digitorum. Very cool muscle. Look at that. My daughter's running around, sorry. Look at that insertion to all four of your fingers, not including your thumb, which is a finger. So to 4 of 5 of your fingers. And you can see how the tendons are interconnected. That kind of contributes to the fact that it's harder to extend certain fingers alone. We all know we can extend our pointer finger. And if we've ever been mad driving, you know you can extend your middle finger by itself. It's tougher to extend the ring finger and actually the pinky. You drink your tea, your pinky goes up. Anyway, so that has to do with the way that these are all interconnected. Anyway, so Ed comes off this common extensor tendon, and then it goes into the dorsal aspect of these 4 fingers. 2 of your fingers, let me just make sure I'm going in the right order. Okay, I am. 2 of these fingers have a little extra help in terms of finger extension. So Ed is responsible for extending these 4 fingers, but your pinky has an extra muscle called extensor digiti minimi, kind of a funny name, and it's a super long muscle considering it only extends your pinky. But if we remove some of this stuff and click on it, we can see it goes all the way up to the common extensor tendon. It's this long, thin muscle. We also have extensor indicis, which is like extensor digiti minimi. It's an extra extensor muscle to your index finger. So extensor digiti minimi and extensor indicis are 2 finger extensors that support Ed, extensor digitorum. There's some kind of mnemonic to remember all this, like Ed, and then there's Ed's iguana, and Ed's dear mother, and Ed's crazy uncle. There's names, but I forget it. Google it. That brings us to one of our last extensors here, extensor carpi ulnaris, which extends your wrist and does ulnar deviation. There it is, extensor carpi ulnaris. So let's run through that again. Brachioradialis, extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, Ed, extensor digitorum, extensor digiti minimi. What's this one? Oh yeah, sorry. Extensor digiti minimi, extensor indicis. This is kind of cool in a real cadaver to follow this tendon. It does this weird little snaking pathway here. That you could be quizzed with or without Ed here. Okay. I don't think it makes it any harder or easier having Ed there, so I'll just try to get you the best view I can on the quiz. And then again, extensor digiti minimi. And then extensor carpi ulnaris. So we've done all these. We've done all these guys. Good job, you guys. We're not quite done. There's a couple more, 3 more to be precise. And it's this thing, these 3 tendons right here, and we call it the brevis sandwich. It's APL, EPB, oh, that's a P, and EPL. Okay, and what does that stand for? Abductor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis brevis, and extensor pollicis longus. We call this a brevis sandwich because it's a brevis and then a longus on either side. Just like a peanut butter sandwich has peanut butter in the middle and bread on either side, the brevis sandwich has a brevis in the middle and a longus on either side. Longus and brevis are just terms referring to how long a tendon is, okay? So let's look at them. So here is abductor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis brevis, because it only goes to the middle phalanx, and then extensor pollicis longus, which goes all the way to the distal phalanx. That's your thumbs up muscle. It's pretty cool because it wraps around Lister's tubercle in this interesting way. It sort of uses it as a pulley. And if you stick your thumb up, you'll probably see two tendons. You'll see extensor pollicis longus, and then you'll see this tendon sort of as one, unless you're really skinny or you have a weird genetic thing where the tendons aren't in a sleeve. Most people, they're in a common sleeve, so you can't really see them separately, but you might. Check it out. Or you might not see any of them if you're like me, who's gained some quarantine pounds over the past couple months. But those are the tendons. You need to know them from the muscle bellies too. Fortunately, they're in the same order, right? So abductor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis brevis, and extensor pollicis longus. And I almost forgot a muscle up here called supinator. Supinator's job is to help the biceps and do supination. One muscle is stronger in different positions, right? So in flexion, the biceps will be really strong, and extension, the supinator will be strong. So, oh boy, do we do a quick recap? I think we do. We're 20 minutes in. From the top to bottom, pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor carpi ulnaris. Let's hide those. Okay, those are your first four. That's like the area code of your phone number. Flexor digitorum superficialis, flexor digitorum profundus, flexor pollicis longus, pronator quadratus. You did it. That's the anterior compartment. Posterior compartment, brachioradialis, extensor pollicis longus. I'm sorry, whoa! That's what happens when you try to go quick. Extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor digitorum, supinator, extensor carpi ulnaris. Let's come down here a little bit. Extensor digiti minimi, extensor indicis, abductor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis brevis, extensor pollicis longus. No problem, right, guys? It's not too bad. Just be happy you don't need to know innervations, nerve roots, origins, insertions. Watch this video a couple times. You'll do great on the quiz. I know you can do it. Thanks, guys.